Let's learn what moral philosophy is. Moral philosophy is a process of contemplation or a product of thinking about the deep wisdom regarding the goodness or badness of an action or deeds carried out in everyday life. In the context of the Indonesian state, as we know, Pancasila has become the basis of ethical thinking or the behavior of society and state officials.
Pancasila, as the philosophy or way of life of the Indonesian nation, is essentially a value that makes Pancasila the source of all elaborations of legal norms, moral norms, and state norms. The state norm in equation is political ethics. To understand political ethics and moral philosophy, first, you must be able to distinguish between ethic morals and character.
In implementing and administering the state, political ethics demands that state power be exercised in accordance with certain norms, consisting of three principles, namely, first, the principle of legality or legality of law is carried out in accordance with applicable law. Second, legalize and run democratically. And third one is implemented based on moral principles or not contrary to prevailing morals.
Then, what about the behavior of public officials? Is it in accordance with Pancasila ethical standards? Let's look in the following explanation. Do you ever remember the story of Sukarno and Buya Hamka? Differences in the political views led to Sukarno imprisoning Buya Hamka at that time on charge of planning the assassination of Sukarno and was imprisoned for 2 years. Long story short, before Sukarno died, he once advised Buya Hamka via Suryo that when Sukarno died, Buya Hamka had to pray for him and ask Buya Hamka to be the prayer imam. He sincerely carried out Sukarno's last message that had imprisoned him.
The story of Buya Hamka and Sukarno can serve as an example of good political ethics, as well as an example of a reverence to political ethics that should be carried out by public officials. Example cases of executive political ethics. Do you remember the history of the French Revolution and what happened behind it? Until 1789, King Louis XVI and his wife Maria Antoinette were French leaders who were very greedy. They used people money from tax proceeds for their personal interests. This became the dominant trigger for public anger with the French government at that time, which ultimately led to the outbreak of the French Revolution. At that time, the people rebelled in various ways, one of which was by storming the Bastille prison and taking a death penalty policy in the form of beheading for King Louis XVI and his wife Maria Antoinette.
The example of judicial case in a political ethics. Constitutional Court Judge bribery case. The constitutional justice allegedly received bribes from import meat entrepreneurs who own 3 companies for the purpose of reviewing the law on animal farming and animal health, which regulates restriction on meat imports. Bribes were received 3 times, to the last being secured by the KPK was $20 or around 300 million rupiah. As a judge at the Constitutional Court, this really showed the moral defects and the ethics of public officials in the interest of both parties that are detrimental to the country and the people.
The last example are legislative case, corruption that doing by some congressmen. At that time, the chairman of somewhere in DPRD was suspected of receiving a bribe of 700 million rupiah from the head of this City Housing Public Works and Building Supervision Service, or DPU PPB, in 2015. The value of the distribution is varied. As many as 18 members of this city DPRD are still being accused in the trial at the Tipikor Court. Meanwhile, 22 members of this council are still undergoing detention as suspects in Jakarta. With the disclosure of the case, the legislative function of the city, DPRD, was paralyzed. That illustration from before is an example of the bad behavior of public officials entering the campaign period. Behavior such as vilifying political opponents, attempts to bring down political opponents with sara, to using the element of money and spreading hoax is a strategy for political officials to get as many votes as possible in elections. Pancasila morals and ethics should be a PR for all components of society, and we are the nation's next generation.
So, what are you waiting for? We, as a society, can also prevent and stop this behavior from happening. If you find a bad campaign practice, for example money politics, spreading hoax, attempts to bring down political opponents with sara, and so on, report them immediately to the election committee body, okay?